Alzheimer's is not the same as dementia. That's what we're really going to do. Get at these cognitive functioning and dysfunctioning that happens over the life course. Particularly as we age, we become more susceptible to these dysfunctions. So Alzheimer's is actually the leading cause of dementia. And dementia is this like cognitive dysfunction. It's actually what's called a syndrome. Famously, we see cases such as Wendy Williams and Bruce Willis with frontal temporal dementia, and even TBI, traumatic brain injuries that cause the brain not to function as intended. We'll get into the research of the newest pharmaceuticals, along with what you can do in terms of lifestyle. Because we've heard like, oh, do these crossword puzzles and your brain will be a lot healthier. Well, it's not that easy. So we'll unpack a little bit about that. One of the big first things to note, even though there are many cases of when we see people who are younger have symptoms of dementia, it's actually really rare. So as you see over here in this graph, that most people, even in the 60s into their 70s, less than 8%, right? About 7% or less develop some type of dementia. It's only when you start to get into the mid 70s where you start to see it as about 14%, and then the 80s and 90s you start to see this approaching around 50%. It's actually hard to know when people who are living have Alzheimer's disease. The only real sure proven way right now is when people die and we cut open their brains. But we know that this is not inevitable. There's like a myth that getting Alzheimer's or dementia is inevitable. Yes, there are definitely cognitive declines that happen with age, but as we learned in studies of exemplar aging, right, the 90 plus study, that dementia and Alzheimer's doesn't necessarily need to happen. There's people in their hundreds that are able to be cognitively all there. Right? Declines are inevitable, but developing these dysfunctions is not. So we discuss a lot about pathology of cognition, right? What happens when people experience dysfunction? But when is it normal cognitive aging? So the first thing that happens is we get slower, right? We call this the speed of processing. This usually peaks in the 20s and 30s, right? Think about like a computer, you're processing really fastly. So as people age, it starts to slowly decline. How fast you get something and able to ingest and process materials. This also dovetails with your working memory. So working memory, I guess you could parallel that if a computer to like RAM, right? This is like the active memory that keeps getting cycled and cycled and cycled again. And when we're younger in their 20s and 30s, this is able to like refresh really fast, refresh. And as you are able to process, you're able to refresh and refresh with the speed of processing. As people age into their 30s, 40s, and 50s, this starts to slow down. And this slowdown is just a natural process. These are human peaks of when people are able to process information. But as people get into these older ages, they start to use experiences. They start to use schemas. Instead of just using raw horsepower to understand the world and information and figure out solutions. So all of this is in the name of functioning. The ability to function in the world is how people get diagnosed with cognitive impairments. If they're not able to function in the world, that's when they would be diagnosed with cognitive impairments. So there are many aspects that are normal, just due to developments and aging past the 30s. So actually, we start to see crystallized intelligence, the use of experience and schemas, become at its peak in the 50s, 60s, and mid 60s. Usually, that's like understanding the world and really focusing on experience and schema. This is when people in their 50s and 60s actually have the highest financial health, right? They make the most money. They're starting to peak in their earning potentials because they're using all of this experience. As opposed to when you're younger, many things are new. So you are really focused on speed, just raw horsepower to understand and navigate the world. It is only when you start aging, this becomes an impairment to functioning, that you really start to see issues with cognition with aging. And it's normal generally in terms of memories to like, oh, where did I leave my keys? Many of these aspects of how we navigate the world is this bigger suite called executive functioning. And executive functioning is pretty much, it's part of it is working memory, part of it is being able to set shift, right? Executive set shifting, being able to, let's just say you want to go to the grocery store, but you have to plan beforehand, like what time are you gonna go? You gotta get your stuff ready, you have to get ready. But being able to just even go, get up, drive, figure the routes, and figure out the timing, right? Because it's a complex world. So this is where the use of executive functioning is so important. So being able to navigate a complex world takes planning, and that planning takes the use of working memory, speed of processing, and just even just memory of a route and crystallized intelligence of some sort. So when we see dysfunctions to executive functioning, this is where we start to see people in the later stages, particularly in the 70s and 80s, they start to get more diagnosed with mild cognitive impairments. That doesn't necessarily mean they cannot function in the world, they just might be a little slower. They might need more assistance. And nowadays, we're going to see even more with technologies being able to assist. And one aspect of all of this is creativity. So creativity is really a combination of doing something novel plus useful and putting those together to make something. This creativity really depends on the field, but we start to see in the life course that just doesn't happen in younger ages. It happens in a combination. Usually you have to get enough experience to be able to figure out the lay of the land, and then once you gain that experience, you're able to figure out creative avenues or pain points that people might not experience. I know this chart says the sciences creativity peaks between the 20s and 40s, but that's not really true in terms of putting things like together. It really depends on the field. Now to what is not normal aging. This is one of the scariest parts. When we see younger people start to develop these cognitive impairments. Famously, Wendy Williams, the talk show and radio personality, and Bruce Willis, the famous actor, have developed these dementias earlier in the lifespan. As you see in this figure, frontal temporal dementia, right? These really rare forms of dementia really hit people in their 40s and 60s. This is very, very, very unusual in terms of when we talk about the development of traditional dementias. Usually traditional dementias happen in the mid 50s to in the 70s. This is when we start to see usual declines that may be in cognitive functioning. But when people are hit with these frontal temporal dementias, we start to see this really, really young. Likewise, this pathway is generally a gradual progression down, right? Gradual declines. But when we see these abnormal frontal temporal dementia, you actually start to see it being a rapid. Something happens really fast and all of a sudden. This is where we see a lot of personality changes or behavioral markers as like, oh wait, something is definitely wrong. But when it comes to dementias, traditional dementias with aging, you start to see this gradual decline. There's no heavy, like right away, overnight, something happens. It's usually progressive. Likewise, we start to see this become gradual and only until later stages of Alzheimer's disease and dementias, then we start to see the personality or these severe changes in the person itself. Usually in frontal temporal dementia, we start to see the memories are still there, but the personality changes relatively earlier. Later dementias, we start to see this massive impairments earlier, and that's like usually the first hallmark. Oh wait, I think something is wrong. The bills are starting to stack up. So this is one of the big ways we start to see that there is something wrong. When they are not able to function and you start to literally see missed bills, misplaced objects that are important, disorganization, missed appointments. So we start to really see issues with executive functioning and the inability to navigate the world. That's where we start to see memory becoming a big hallmark of age-related dysfunctions. As opposed to here, we start to see this behavioral personality aspects because there's certain damages to the brain, particularly to behavior, speech with the aphasia. So we start to see more behavioral markers here as opposed to more memory cognitive markers later in dementias. So just to note, these have to be diagnosed clinically by a professional. You might notice misbills and everything, but what dementia is a clinical diagnosis of dysfunctions. But a clinical medical professional has to give that diagnosis, not you or TikTok University. Like I said before, some people, they actually have the Alzheimer's disease pathology in their brain, but they were never clinically diagnosed, right? Like a professional didn't see that they couldn't function in the world, in the cognitive realm. So this is when we get at this issue with cognitive reserve. So many of these exemplary aging studies, such as the NUN study and the 90+ study, really highlight that developing Alzheimer's and related dementias is not part of normal aging process, because there are many people who live and die and they donate their brains to show that even though they might have the pathology or may not have the pathology, they're still able to function in the world. Many of this we attribute to this. They're still able to function because of this cognitive reserve. So if you think about a path, think about like you're traveling a road in your brain, right? This is a neuron, right? And this is you, the car, right? And this is like instructions. If you're able to still function in society, right? Get from A to B, right? That means you're still functioning. But pathology, right? Something such as Alzheimer's is an actual organic pathology, right? It's like a roadblock, right? From the synapses, it's like, oh, you're not able to. There's a roadblock. So people propose this cognitive reserve. So let's just say this main artery was blocked, but through the use from developing many different cognitive stimulating activities, you have all these alternative routes, right, that you could go to still be able to function. And these routes have been paved and developed through a life course, a lifetime of doing cognitive stimulating activities. So you're still able to function. So this is a proposed theory of why we start to even seeing in the NUD study, particularly people with organic pathologies in their brain when they die, they're still able to function because they were never clinically diagnosed with having dementia. This is something that provides very promising outlets to understand like what we could actually do to control or at least like mitigate the risks. Because at the end of the day, this pathology overwhelms this cognitive functioning, right? It will block all of these roads to when you're not able to function anymore, right? It's this pathology, we still don't know 100% why this pathology develops for certain people and why it does it for others, but it eventually blocks everything. So this is actually when we see people who have high cognitive reserve, they start to have steeper slopes of decline. And that's actually good because you start to see, oh, they're functioning fine and then they couldn't function anymore. They have steeper slopes because they're able to withhold this pathology longer. They're still able to function longer. As opposed to somebody with low cognitive reserve, it happens a lot faster, right? It happens a lot faster. And you start to see that they start to decline earlier in the lifespan and they're not able to function. So this cognitive reserve essentially buys us more time, but this doesn't necessarily mean it cures this pathology. So one of the biggest aspects of building cognitive reserve that has been found is just education, being a learner, but other things such as just cognitive stimulating activities, socialization, novelty creates new pathways. So we start to see that. We also know like exercise, diets. Likewise, we start to also see sleep as a big component. The issue is what's novel and new and stimulating actually depends on the person. Socialization is such a powerful aspect because every conversation, even with the same person at a different time, might lead to different things. So this is where we start to see socialization being so important. But unfortunately, as people grow older, they start to lose hearing and memory, and they start to become embarrassed. And that actually leads them to isolate themselves. And that is where it becomes very dangerous, right? Because then you start to see the downhill declines, both in physical and cognitive health and also mental health. So social isolation, especially when people get older, really takes out a lot of this component of enriching cognitive experiences. Social circles, as they grow older, they tend to shrink as well, as we talked about with social emotional selectivity theory. So those were lifestyle changes that could build cognitive reserve for combating cognitive dysfunction. What we're starting to see now are promising drugs, the pharmaceuticals, to try and get at the pathology, the Alzheimer's disease pathology. One of the big issues of this is they're controversially being passed because for the longest time, for over 20 fucking years, all these animal trials failed, right? They literally failed when it gets to human trials. So I don't know what this is. Oh, I guess this is a nose, and let's just say fails, right? And people were desperate, right? Because we know this Alzheimer's disease is really becoming more and more prevalent, they started to relax the criteria, particularly the FDA, ignoring some of the rigor put in by the scientific panel to pass these drugs or make them more suitable for human consumption. What a lot of these drugs do, it actually relaxes this blood-brain barrier, and it allows your natural immune system to wipe out some of these tangles, these pathologies. But they costs so much money because it is an experimental procedure. And they think the amyloid hypothesis and the tau and all these aspects of why people develop Alzheimer's, they try to kind of reverse this, but we don't really see any data, like any solid data that it actually works. So just to recap it all, Alzheimer's and related dementias, they are not the same thing, but then also that is not a part of normal aging. We expect declines in aging, cognitive declines, to just happen naturally, especially when we talked about many things start to peak in their 20s and then 30s, but declines happen naturally with age. It only becomes cognitive dysfunction when we see a person's inability to navigate the world. And we see these early warning signs, especially when we see like bills start to stack up. It's okay to forget certain words and other things when they're tip of the tongue, but if they're having a hard time to actually have a conversation. So these have to deal with dysfunction and inability to navigate the world. Most people don't develop Alzheimer's and related dementias earlier in life, right? Even into the 60s, most people don't have that. They're still able to they're all cognitively intact. They're all there. And one of the ways to kind of starve off cognitive dysfunction is building this cognitive, right? And these cognitive reserves, these stimulating novel activities that help build these multiple different pathways to being able to function in society and with your cognitive resources. And one of the biggest ones that we start to see is socialization. That is one of the biggest ones because it offers a lot of novelty. Every relationship's different, every time in the relation is different, and that provides a lot of cognitive stimulation, because when we start to see people get older and they socially isolate, we start to see massive declines in cognition and performance and in mental and physical health. So socialization to build cognitive reserve. And then we also see many of these new pharmaceutical interventions that are really promising, but they're really in their early stages of understanding are these actually effective. So this is a very promising area, but generally it doesn't have a really good track record because over 20 plus years, a lot of it has been shown to work in animal models, but ineffective in humans. So this is something to monitor. The only things we could really do now are build our cognitive reserve stimulating activities and monitor what's going on in pharma. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Peace. I believe I can fly. Peace.